Welcome again. Thank you, Michael. We'll get right started in just a moment. This episode is taped at Blue Beach Studios in Redondo Beach. This is another episode of the tape. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Uh, Please search Blue Beach 310 on all socials. Subscribe, like our videos on YouTube, and follow us. And please subscribe to our Patreon if you like what we have. We have a lot more content coming, a lot more interviews. Find us at bluebeach.tv. So thank you again. Michael, thank you again. Like I said, I've been following your work for many years. I want to welcome you. Just to get to a little intro, and then we'll get to kind of discussion. It should be cool.
Okay, great.
So yeah, I know you're an author, researcher, and you talk about human antiquity. Your newest book is Extreme Human Antiquity. We'll talk about your book from 1993, of course, Forbidden Archaeology, and your new book is just a continuation of that. And then we'll talk a little bit about how all that stuff connects to consciousness and spirituality and stuff. What I really wanted, I kind of wanted to begin at the Forbidden Archaeology and kind of the artifacts, and then where it leads to. Also, you've written Human Devolution too. I first heard of you, I remember on Coast to Coast with Art Bell many years ago, and of course, you've been on many times with George Norrie as well. So, before we get into any of that, I really want to talk about your academic and like scientific background because you kind of studied philosophy of science, like history of science, and that kind of stuff. So,
I'm an outsider. I don't have an earned PhD or anything like that. Uh, how I got into this has something to do with the way I was raised. I came from a military family. My father was an intelligence officer in the Air Force. And that meant a couple of things for me as I was growing up. First, it meant our family was moving around a lot into different places in the United States and abroad. When I was of high school age, I lived in Germany and went to an American high school there. And on my vacations, I would go to different cities in Europe, Paris, Rome, Berlin, which at that time was under communist rule. East Berlin was, anyways. And I also went to Stockholm once. And in the Stockholm Youth Hostel, I met some young people who had traveled overland from Europe to India and come back. In those days, it was possible. It's not a very easy thing to do these days. But they told me about their experiences in India, the Ganges River, the Himalayan mountains, Kashmir, different yogis and mystics that they met. And I kind of became a little bit fascinated with Indian philosophy, which I started looking into. And another feature of growing up that way is I learned that there is such a thing as secret knowledge. At that age, I was growing up among people in military intelligence, CIA, the Foreign Service, and people like that. So that influenced me also. So in these ancient Sanskrit writings of India, I found accounts of human populations that existed millions of years ago on Earth, much farther back in time than our modern archaeologists would think possible. And I kind of wondered about that. Are these accounts of extreme human antiquity, are they just some kind of mythology that the authors of these ancient texts that go back a couple thousand years invented, or is there some factual basis to it? So that's what got me looking into the history of archaeology, because when I looked in the current textbooks of archaeology, I found only the evidence, only the discoveries that conform to the current dominant paradigm, which at that time, when I started the research, was about 100,000 years. Today, they've extended it back to about 300,000 years. But at that time, they were saying 100,000. And all the evidence in the textbooks supported that idea. But because of my exposure to confidential knowledge involving the intelligence services, I thought, well, let me look beyond what's here in the textbooks. Let me start looking into the original scientific reports by archaeologists, anthropologists, geologists, other scientists digging into the earth. And when I did that, I started finding evidence that human beings like us existed far further back in time than the modern consensus would allow. So I had to ask myself a question: if this evidence is there in the original scientific reports, why isn't it in the textbooks? And I concluded it was because of a process of knowledge filtration. Now, my university education was uh, in the area of international relations. I was in the George Washington University School of International Affairs because at that time I was thinking I would kind of go in the family footsteps and uh, get an education that would qualify me to go into one of the intelligence services.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I became a little bit disillusioned with that, but the experience was helpful in getting the research done that I needed to do and to understand what was happening with this evidence, which most people aren't aware of.
It's kind of knowledge filtration in government and other areas as well, not
You know,
just archaeology.
once I was giving a lecture about my forbidden archaeology work at a university in South Africa. And when I was giving my talk, the students were on vacation. So my audience was the professors of the science departments of the university. And I talked about the archaeological evidence for extreme human antiquity. And it gave many examples of reports of discoveries of human bones, human artifacts, human footprints, published in the professional scientific literature of the past couple of centuries, and pointed out that this evidence is missing from current textbooks and scientific discourse because of this process of knowledge filtration. So after the lecture, I was kind of standing around, and one of the professors came up to me. You know, he kind of looked around, saw that nobody was watching him, and he came up to me and he said, "You know, Mr. Cremo, this process of knowledge filtration that you're talking about, it isn't just in archaeology, it's in my discipline, chemistry, and let me tell you about it." And then he went away, and then another one would come up, say the same thing. You know, Mr. Cremo, this process of knowledge filtration, it's going on in my discipline as well. You know, so you're right, it does operate in a lot of different disciplines. So I had other experiences that kind of confirmed that as well. I mean, one thing I was really surprised about was that when I published Forbidden Archaeology and started to speak at UFO conferences, and I
Right.
was thinking, why are they inviting me? You know, I'm talking about stones and bones, and you know, they're talking about UFOs and aliens and ETs. What's the connection here?
Yeah.
But I could quickly see what the connection was that in both fields, the field I was working in and the field they were working in, it's kind of obvious that there are credible reports of evidence for extraterrestrial life, UAPs, as they're called now, unidentified aerial phenomenon, just like there are credible reports of evidence for extreme human antiquity that get filtered out, you know, so that even though the evidence is there, it just doesn't get out to the public.
The last episode I had a few months ago was actually a professor of mine when I went to university at Cal State Long Beach in the early 2000s, and I had him. He was a professor of he's an archaeology professor, Dr. David Cheatham, and he's a total skeptic. You know, he's actually on ancient aliens. He doesn't believe any of it. I brought up your book, and even back then, I wish I had the textbook, but there was a topic of pseudo archaeology, and your name came up along with Graham Hancock. And even if you brought it up, they wouldn't accept it. It really was forbidden, and it was looked at as like it was non-academic. It's almost like a dogma that they hold on to, right? With certain, and within archaeology especially, but there's enough cases of evidence where even if a few of them are hoaxes, there's far more. They can't all be hoaxes, right? You know?
Yeah,
Yeah. So
yeah. You,
absolutely. Did you hear about the recent discovery? I think it was in a part of China where they discovered. Now it's a little weird because it's inconclusive, but I guess okay. This is from a news article on Live Science. This is from 2022, and it says what happened is they reconstructed a skull that they found in China, and they kind of figured that it was. If you can correct me if I'm wrong, but they figured that it was like a new human ancestor like creature that was so-called dragon man. But maybe you're saying it's not a straight evolution from all these pre human like hominoids like chrome and you think we all existed together with modern man.
Yes, the discovery that you're talking about, I think it was originally made, some fragments of skull
Right.
were found at a site in China. And then much later, using advanced statistical analysis and measurements, they put together the pieces in a different way than they had thought, plays a mixture of features that put it not in any of the known species. Maybe it was the common ancestor of all of them, something to that effect. But it is a fact that at the time I was doing the research and writing and first publishing Forbidden Archaeology, scientists did have a very linear concept of human evolution, that there were some ancient apes and monkeys who, over millions of years, turned into the first hominins, supposed human ancestors like Australopithecus, and then Homo habilis, the first species in the Homo line,
Right.
Neanderthals, and then us. But now in Forbidden Archaeology, I introduced the concept of the coexistence of anatomically modern humans with other species that were thought to be human ancestors. And I pointed out that if you look at all the evidence, what emerges is not a picture of linear evolution, but of coexistence of anatomically modern human skeletons and remains of other hominids that coexisted with them. Right. Now they say they include the Neanderthals coexisted with anatomically modern humans, the creatures they call the Denisovans, who the first specimens of which were uncovered in Siberia a few years ago. And there's other species as well, like what they call the Hobbit, Homo floresiensis, in Indonesia, on Flores Island. Right. So and now they're coming around to a picture that I introduced in Forbidden Archaeology, namely that there's coexistence of hominin types. But I think that coexistence, they think eventually you'll come back to some common ancestor that they all came from. But I say the coexistence continues further and further back in time.
There's another article that it was recent. It was, I don't sure you've heard about it, but I guess there was a fossilized human face or pieces of a fossilized human, nasal bone and skull that were found in Spain. And now they're saying that through some sort of dating, they're thinking that it's, goes back to maybe 1 million years or something estimate, and that they have to maybe rethink the timeline of when human beings were in Europe because they, it was kind of throws them off a little. So do you know anything about that recent discovery?
Yes. What they do is they analyze the, like you said, it's a partial facial bones. And they analyze them, and different researchers will analyze them in different ways. Maybe somebody was saying it belonged to a creature they call Homo heidelbergensis or Homo antecessor. They have different names for different species of Homo, like we're Homo sapiens. That's what the anatomically modern humans are called. So they think there were these human-like ancestors. And some of them will place a fossil in a more primitive species and some in a more advanced. I think about this particular case, they were saying that some of the features of Homo sapiens were appearing a little earlier than they thought. So I kind of think they're taking tiny steps, baby steps, you might say, in the right direction and pushing the origin of Homo sapiens further back in time. Like I said, when I brought out Forbidden Archaeology in the 1990s, they were thinking 100,000 years. By the 2000s, they were thinking 200,000 years. And today, they're thinking about 300,000. But there are discoveries that aren't mentioned in the current textbooks of fossils and artifacts showing a human presence in Europe that go back quite far in time. You know, for example, in the late 19th century, the Italian geologist Giuseppe Ragazzoni found anatomically modern human remains at a place called Castanedolo in the foothills of the Alps in northern Italy. And he found these human bones in strata and layers of sediment that were from the Pliocene period, between 2 and 5 million years old. So you do have reports of discoveries that go much further back in time than the discovery that you mentioned of the partial face bones that indicating an age maybe going back to 1 million years.
Just explain for a little bit, because I mean, this is not the only example, but sometimes when it's when you say that and people are skeptical, they say, "Oh, it's obviously a fake or something." But in that layer of rock, it's that old. So in the layers above and below, usually they're kind of if it's a hoax, they would be disturbed. But usually the layers above and below are not disturbed. So that pretty much means that anything in that found in that time had to have been from that time. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean there are different ways that scientists can react to reports of discoveries like this. And usually they don't deal with the actual specifics of the case, but they will say something like, actually, it was intrusive, came from a higher level and went to that older level.
Because of an earthquake or something? Or
yeah, earth movement through a fissure. I mean, they don't show it. Once I was giving a lecture in Copenhagen in Denmark, and there was an archaeologist in the audience. So I went through a lot of these different cases, and his response was the usual one that scientists give. They say, well, don't you realize that it could have slipped down through a fissure? There could have been some earth movement. The discoverer was the victim of a hoax. The discoverer made a mistake. This discovery was made many years ago, and we've made so much advancement since then. They don't deal with any of the specific evidence in the case to show that these objections really apply. They just throw out a laundry list of possible ways it could be mistaken.
right.
But if you proceed like that, like I think I responded to the archaeologists who raised these points. I said, well, you can say that about anything. I could say, perhaps you're a holographic projection from Mars. If we want to get into possibilities.
Sometimes it's hard for them to kind of accept evidence, but there's so many different cases. I mean, like, for instance, we'll get into a few more, but I know that you talked a lot about there was discoveries at the California gold mines, right, where they found human bones, right? And then also I think there's a case of, you can talk about the, didn't they find in San Diego area like mammoth tusks, and then there was like presence of human markings on them? So yeah, those two cases, you explained those, right?
When people or organizations or companies or government agencies are doing any kind of earth-moving work, for construction of highways, bridges, railroads, housing developments, whatever. If they encounter anything like bones, especially human bones or evidence for a human presence, they have to stop their work. They have to get in touch with archaeologists, and they have to pay. The company or the government agency has to pay for an archaeological or paleontological impact report or evaluation. And then when they get that done, the report is filed and they can go on with their work. So actually, most archaeologists who are employed today are not working in universities. They're working in what's called contract archaeology, where it's just their business to do these archaeological impact reports. So when they were building a highway through San Diego, I think it was 124 California State Road highway, they encountered, as you were mentioning, some mammoth bones with cut marks on them, like that, the cut marks that would be made by humans who had killed that animal or found the dead carcass and butchered it. And they also found stone tools capable of making those marks along with the bones. So they did their archaeological and paleontological impact report. They dated the bones using the uranium series method as being over 300,000 years old. And that's kind of anomalous. It's unusual for two reasons. First of all, that's over 300,000 years is older than any evidence for Homo sapiens existing anywhere in the world. And what to speak of North America, the current dominant consensus view among archaeologists and other scientists is that no humans were present in North America any earlier than about 20,000, maybe 25,000 years ago. So to have evidence like this showing a human presence at over 300,000 years was really pretty astonishing. But it didn't get widely known because these archaeological impact reports that are done for these government agencies just wind up in their files. They're not even published in the professional scientific literature. So I think there's a huge amount of evidence that could be looked at if people could have access to those archaeological impact reports. So the report sat in the Caltrans office. That's the California Transportation Agency that was responsible for building the highway. It sat in their reports, but somehow or other, someone leaked it to Virginia Steen McIntyre, who is a geologist that I know, and she passed it on to me. And I wrote about it in a column that I had called The Forbidden Archaeologist in Atlantis Rising magazine. But in more recent years, scientists have actually published a report on it in Nature, which is one of the primary scientific journals in the world, very prestigious. And they published it because they redid the test on it and they got an age of 100,000 years instead of 300,000. And they felt, okay, we can take the risk of publishing with that date, which was still pretty astonishing because it's still beyond the mainstream consensus in archaeology. So that was a really interesting case. Discoveries that you mentioned are from an earlier period in archaeology, the mid to late 19th century. Mm-hmm. And at that time, gold was discovered in California in the Sierra Nevada mountains near, in Tuolumne County. And other counties also, the whole gold mining region. The miners were digging tunnels into the sides of mountains like Table Mountain. Right. And they were finding deep inside their tunnels human skeletal remains, obsidian spear points, stone mortars and pestles, all kinds of evidence of a human presence in formations that modern geologists tell us are 40 to 50 million years old. And these discoveries came to the attention of Dr. J.D. Whitney, who was the chief government geologist of California. And he wrote a massive report about them that was published by Harvard University in the year 1880. And the response from the scientific world was heavily negative. Dr. William Holmes, an anthropologist at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., said if Dr. Whitney had understood the theory of human evolution, he wouldn't have published his study with the conclusions that he reached, despite the imposing array of evidence with which he was confronted. In other words, I'll translate that into more plain English. If the facts didn't fit the emerging theory of evolution, they should be cast into oblivion, which is basically what happened.
Yeah, that's kind of a goes into like that they have an agenda and they don't want to hear anything else. It's very closed-minded and dogmatic about it. If to be honest, that's kind of how I view it. To like just kind of ridicule or ignore evidence. There's one thing I wanted to ask you though, kind of. So, for instance, how you mentioned the tusks, the bones of the tusks that they found, they dated that to approximately 300,000, and then they said, okay, it's 100,000 years old. Is there a way to do that with human bones? And if so, have they done it to any of these cases you're talking about to at least say that the bones are, 100,000 years or whatever? Have they done that to human bones to date the human bones themselves from skeletons?
For example, the Castanello discoveries made by the Italian geologist Robertoni. The initial response to them, this again is a discovery that dates from the late 19th century, 1880s, around that time.
Okay.
He had uncovered these skeletons. And of course, the first objection was that got to be intrusive burials. But he studied very carefully the formations above the skeleton as he was excavating it. And he said all the layers above the skeleton were intact and undisturbed, meaning it wasn't really possible that, say, maybe in Roman times, a couple thousand years ago, somebody died on the surface and then his relatives or friends dug a grave, put the body down there, and that is the explanation.
Right.
So he kind of ruled out that. He was a professional geologist. He was very much aware of that possibility, and he showed it did not apply. Still, later in the 20th century, late 20th century, radiocarbon dating was done on these bones, which were found in a formation 3 or 4 million years old. So radiocarbon dating, one has to study it very carefully because it's based on the principle that there are two kinds of carbon in an organism. And we know what they are. There's carbon-12 and carbon-14. Carbon-14 is radioactive. Carbon-12 is not. So that means if something's radioactive, that means it decays into other elements by a measure of time they call a half-life. And the half-life of carbon-14 is about 5,000 years. So that means when the organism dies, the amount of carbon-12 stays the same, but the amount of carbon-14 goes down. Every 5,000 years, a half of what's remaining disappears. It doesn't disappear, it's transformed into other elements. So the carbon-14 goes down. And by the time you go through 20 half-lives, about 100,000 years, there's no more left to measure. I mentioned the uranium series method. That can be used to date bone up to about a few 100,000 years old. But if we're talking about bones older than that, there's no method that could be used to directly date the bone. You have to use other methods to date the layers of sediment in which they're found. So now here's the important point. If a bone, say like a human bone really is 2 million years old,
right?
If you date it using the carbon-14 method, the radiocarbon method, if the bone, although it is 2 million years old, is contaminated with the least amount of modern carbon-14, it will show an age that is falsely young, 100,000 years or less. And in order to avoid that, there has to be very careful processing of the bone. Bone is made of a protein called collagen. And the best way to date a fossil human bone is to get the collagen separated out from the sample and test it, make sure it's only the bone collagen, and then you can do the radiometric dating on it.
Okay.
But not every radiometric date is done using that strict of a protocol.
Right.
So in the case of the Castaneda bones, a British scientist did use the radiocarbon method to date the bone, and he said it's 10,000 years old, not 3 or 4 million. So we asked him, what purification method did you use to ensure that you weren't getting any contaminants of modern carbon-14, which can enter a bone from bacteria in the museum. It can, if somebody touches it and has a little skin oil on it, if they touch the bone, that can contaminate it with recent carbon. When the bone was in the ground, it could have been contaminated with recent carbon coming from groundwater, or So he said, no, I didn't use those purification methods, but I still think it has to be 10,000 years old. It couldn't possibly be 2 or 3 million. So you have to look at each case carefully.
Yeah.
And what I did in Forbidden Archaeology was give the details of the case, including those opinions that were negative. And I include whatever dating methods were used, and leave it ultimately up to the reader to make up his or her own mind.
Yeah. Well, that's an important point, because a lot of times it's very much, and I've experienced it in the academic world, they don't want any outsiders to have any opinions, and if what they say kind of has to be viewed as the truth. And, that's kind of not how science works. It's always evolving. There was one really cool discovery, I think I read about that you talked in your book. It was by, I think, Leakey, where they discovered a human footprint, and then they said that it was a modern human footprint, but then it was a date they couldn't place modern humans. So kind of, is that accurate of a description of what happened?
Yeah, that's a discovery that was made by Mary Leakey,
Right.
who was the wife of Louis Leakey, who was a very prominent paleontologist, archaeologist. It was kind of like a family enterprise.
Yeah.
Children were also have also become active in archaeology. But Mary Leakey in 1979, with her team, discovered anatomically modern human footprints at a place called Laetoli in Tanzania in East Africa. And in her original report, which was published in National Geographic magazine, which funded the research, in her original report, and I just want to point out, we're not talking here about 1 or 2 footprints. We're talking about dozens of footprints of 3 individuals walking in volcanic ash deposits.
Was one of them a smaller footprint, or were they all adults?
I think one of them was smaller.
Okay, because I threw it. Okay.
And, they became preserved. Some sediments washed over them. The sediments filled in the footprints, and then further sediments were deposited on top of them. And when they scraped away the top layers, they came down to the layer with the footprints in it. And the problem was the volcanic ash deposits in which the footprints were made are 3,700,000 years old. So how did they explain the footprints? Well, they said, there must have been some kind of hominid that existed at that time, some species of Australopithecus or some other genus that had feet exactly like modern human feet. In other words, maybe an ape-like body, but feet like those of modern humans.
Hominid, yeah.
It's an interesting idea. I mean, again, it shows how the knowledge filtering process operates. If you've got evidence for a possible human presence. Well, just to interpret it in such a way that it fits the paradigm. No, it wasn't humans that made those footprints. It was creatures that were like Australopithecus or Homo habilis that had feet exactly like those of a modern human being. But scientists have discovered the foot bones of the Australopithecines who existed at that time. I met one of them once in South Africa at a meeting of the World Archaeological Congress that was being held there. And this, in his report at that meeting, this scientist had shown that the foot bones of Australopithecus were not like that of a modern human being. It had, first of all, a first toe, like your big toe. It would go out to the side like a human thumb. And the other toes, on the foot were like short human, like human fingers. Mm-hmm. So during the question session, I asked him, you're saying these footprints are those of a creature like that which made the footprints at Laetoli in Tanzania that were found by Mary Leakey. So, but those footprints don't show the big toe going out to the side and long toes. They show a footprint that looks exactly human. And he said, well, the creature was actually walking. I mean, there were three of them, not just one, but the creatures were walking with their big toe pressed up against the other ones like this. And they were walking with their long toes kind of curled under. And I was just thinking, I mean, you have three of them, dozens of prints. You would think that at least one of them would be walking at least part of the time with, its foot in its normal position. And another thing is, in those Laetoli footprints, you don't see any knuckle prints of curled under toes. So, if this kind of thing just happened once or twice, maybe you could overlook it. Say, okay, there's a few questionable discoveries here, but the vast preponderance of evidence supports our point of view that human beings weren't around at that time. They only came much later.
I mean, in your opinion, then those footprints were modern. They were us. They were modern people that were back then making those footprints, and that's what you kind of. It's. And have they done like blind tests where they like shown it and compared it to like regular it's. They should be able to do a blind test now modernly, like comparing them, right? And people couldn't tell the difference. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, Mary Leakey herself said in her original report, they're indistinguishable from modern human footprints.
Okay, yeah, there you go.
Part of her group also agreed. For example, paleontologist Tim White looked at them and studied them and said, these are human. There's no mistake about it. They're no different than the footprints that you or I would make if we were walking on the beach today. But you say from Redondo Beach, well, you were walking out on the beach. Those are the kind of footprints you would expect to see. So at least I would say they would have to qualify their statement. Well, either this was made by some hominin, some species of Australopithecus that we haven't discovered yet, that had a foot skeleton exactly like that of a modern human being, or human beings were present.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, it's amazing to think about. I mean, even if I run into a lot of people in my life that kind of are against the idea, whether they're it's for academics, so-called science, or religious reasons. But even if, 50 years ago, and now that it should kind of be not controversial, although it is. I don't know why. But yeah, that's just amazing in itself. I know there's a lot of other reasons, but like the whole knowledge filtration you're talking about, it doesn't fit in with the establishment's viewpoint of what they want you to call so-called human history, right?
Well, here's one thing I would like to say, however. I respect the right of each individual to make up their own minds about this. All I ask is that they either read my book or listen to what I say. And if they individually decide, okay, very, very interesting, Mr. Cremo, but it just doesn't convince me. I respect that. I don't demand that everybody in the scientific world or among the general public agree with what I'm saying, because I think each individual has to consider these things and decide.
Right. It's not about, freedom. It is freedom.
Is when someone uses government or some other organizational structure to enforce their view upon others.
It's about freedom. People should have freedom to believe in, whatever. That's true, which is what I respect about your research. You never had any, sort of dogma. You're just presenting a different viewpoint on the evidence you've found. Taking it a little bit kind of different. So you've mentioned the Vedic texts and how that's how you got interested. You found writings about humans millions of years ago. I know there are others. Can you talk a little bit more, especially like in the Native American spirituality, in terms of the Sumerians, the ancient Egyptians, and even like the Greeks and other cultures? They've all had that universal theme of that there was like people on the planet millions and millions of years ago. The Mayans. Like, can you talk a little bit about other ancient sources that corroborate the same thing you talked about with the Indian texts?
Most of the world's cultures, if you carefully study them, they have the idea that humans have always been around. You were mentioning Native American beliefs. When my book Forbidden Archaeology came out, there was a Native American scholar, a historian, Vine Deloria, who at that time I think was a professor at the University of Colorado in Boulder. He wrote a book called Red Earth, White Lies, when he pointed out that he was a Native American himself, a member of a tribe. I think it was Apache, but could be wrong about that, but that's my recollection. But he wrote very favorably about my book, Forbidden Archaeology, in his book. And he said, this idea, as Native American people, we think we've always been here. It's not that we came over from Siberia, 10,000 years ago, and before that, we weren't here. And part of the evidence that he gives for an ancient Native American tribal presence in North America is that there are places like near in Oregon, there's a mountain. And like many of the mountains in the Sierra Nevadas and the coastal chain, it's volcanic. Mm-hmm. A long time ago, much further back in time than 20,000 or 10,000 years ago, a long time ago, perhaps many millions of years ago, there was a volcanic explosion that broke up the original mountain into three separate peaks, which are called the Three Sisters today. And the tribal people that live in that area have in their legends accounts of that explosion, which rained down ash, and there were flows of lava and ash that kind of drove everyone out for a while, and then they came back. And that event took place in the very, very distant past. So, you do have evidence like that. There's a meteor crater in Arizona that has the same phenomenon, that whatever caused the crater, it landed on Earth and made the crater a long, long time ago. Without looking at the reports, I can't give you the exact date.
It was millions, yeah.
Millions of years. So, and it's the same idea. The tribal people that live around there have in their legends the idea that a star fell and exploded at that place. And it's not something that they would have understood anything about. It was only in the 1970s that modern geologists began to accept that these kind of cosmic impact craters were made by things that shot onto our planet from outer space. But if you look at many of the ancient wisdom traditions, they also have this idea that humans like us have been around since the beginning, which is something that I accept. I don't think we're accidental creatures in an accidental universe. I think the whole thing has some purpose and we're a part of it.
Definitely. No, I mean, it's been talked about, and I think you mentioned it, it's been, there's a lot of, in the Mayan mythology, they go back in terms of their time cycles. Sumerians, I think, and Egyptians both have, like, I think they've had lists of their royalty that goes back tens of thousands of years, if not longer.
Chinese emperor list as well.
Right. And then I believe in the, if I'm not mistaken, in the Mohenjo-Daro, like the Harappan civilization, I was reading that they still have not decoded their language, and that there's rumors that could have lists of royalty that goes back even further in time. So it's very possible. You kind of were leading into it, but, you know, that's just corroborating it among the ancient world and sources. But next kind of question is, you know, all the physical. Okay, so you're saying, let's talk about human devolution. I know you wrote about in consciousness. That's really kind of where it leads to. But can you explain that kind of? It's a bridge to it, like where you've gone from forbidden archaeology and now to where it leads to being about where do we come from? Consciousness. What is a human being, and like what does that really mean about, you know, the nature of reality and science and like what we are?
Sometimes people would ask me after they've read Forbidden Archaeology, they say, well, what difference does it make if human beings appeared a few 100,000 years ago or a few 100 million years ago? I mean, what difference does it make, really? And the difference that it makes is that this evidence, however you want to explain it, it contradicts the current theories, which means there has to be some new idea about where we came from. And in Forbidden Archaeology, I didn't introduce any alternative idea because I wanted people to be free to think about what the alternative should be in their own way. And some people propose, well, maybe the objects in these very ancient times were left by time travelers or extraterrestrials, or maybe the theory of evolution is correct, but humans evolved much earlier than current scientists think. So I wanted them to be free to come up with their own ideas. But scientists also pointed out, one of the scientists who reviewed Forbidden Archaeology in a scientific journal called Geoarchaeology, he said, when you critique a dominant theory, and say it's not correct, it's customary to present some alternative. So on the basis of feedback from my readers, both from the general public and the scientific community, I decided to present an alternative in the book Human Devolution, a Vedic alternative to Darwin's theory. And in that book, I propose, before we even ask the question, where did humans come from, we should first of all ask the question, what is a human being? We should know what it is we're trying to explain. And most scientists today will say, well, we're machines made of molecules. We're purely material beings. That's all there is to it. And as far as consciousness is concerned, well, that's just a temporary byproduct of bioelectrical activity in the brain, in the neurons. And as soon as those chemical interactions are stopped at the time of death, then there's no more consciousness, nothing like that. So that's the standard explanation. And again, it's based on a lot of knowledge filtration that has gone on in the world of science. I think if you actually look at all the available scientific evidence, you'll see that it's much more reasonable to say that a human being is not just a machine made of matter. There's matter, yes, that's part of what we are, but there's also a subtle mind element with very unusual powers, like remote viewing, psychokinesis, and other things like that. And beyond that, there is a conscious self that can exist independently from matter, that has its own individual characteristics. And so I think this role of consciousness in the whole picture of who we are is very important. There's no explanation of how consciousness can come from matter. There are different speculative ideas about it, but there's no actual scientific demonstration of it. And here we're not talking about anything religious, like you could say, I could use the word soul, and people think, well, that's religion. That requires faith, it requires belief. But consciousness, the idea that we are conscious individual selves, is not something that requires faith or belief. It's the most real part of our existence, the most fundamental fact that we're all constantly aware of, that I'm conscious, you're conscious, all the listeners and viewers are conscious. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this kind of discourse that we're having at the present moment.
Right. And I've always talked about this, and like, it's true. People kind of don't really think about it, but biologically, chemically, you know, when you think about all the neurons and like you're saying, physically and matter and all the brain, they cannot, it's like the biggest mystery, right? They cannot explain how all those chemicals put together and all the systems in our body explains our physical state of alertness and awareness and being. And yeah, you can call it whatever you kind of want, spirit, whatever, but like, it's kind of just amazing that people kind of don't think about that more. And I think a lot of people get lost because they don't really take time to think about what that means, but it's true. And they can't. There's no way to chemically, biologically explain it. They can explain everything else and kind of how our body works and like that. But let's talk a little bit. Okay, so in terms of how it being an ancient idea, you know, from the Vedics and all these other ancient cultures, I know, you know, it's 2025 and like now getting a little bit into more like blending it with the modern ideas. Where do you come down on kind of it all relating to the evolving world of AI and like simulation theory? Does that relate at all to the ancient ideas to you?
Yes, because according to the worldview and cosmology that's found in the Vedic texts, it's like we are in a simulated reality. We are in a virtual reality system because the real self, the conscious self, which is individual and personal, it's non-material. It has an origin in a realm beyond the realm of matter, which we currently inhabit. So the conscious self is normally meant to exist on that level, where it's not subject to the restrictions that conscious selves experience on this level of reality, where we identify with a bodily vehicle made of the material elements that is different from us. And these bodily vehicles that we occupy are temporary. They come into existence at a certain point of time, and they go out of existence at a certain point in time. And the conscious self is not in its natural state limited like that. So here we experience that limitation as a series of embodiments in different kinds of bodily vehicles, which we are not. You know, it's like if you get in your car and you think you're your car, you've made a mistake. It's a vehicle that you use for a certain purpose.
That's like your brain, you know, your brain's just controlled, but it's not, you know, this is just kind of the best part of being a human, being curious and thinking about this. And I think that's something that I really have enjoyed and like respected about your work, because it really makes you think. I got to think there's millions of other people that think about this stuff all the time. And since I was younger, I've always had that open mind to think. I've never had a closed mind. I've always thought of the possibilities, and your work really, among others, has inspired that curiosity to just really think about that and think and wonder and just be about the mystery. But in terms of consciousness, so yeah, you know, you're talking about the ancient versus, you know, wisdom versus like modern AI and simulation theory. Do you know a little bit about, because I know there's some data and stuff and research that has been done on reincarnation. I know there's some people that have children and they've done research in different countries of like past lives. Do you know anything about that and kind of how that could be studyable and like possible to like have people that have had past lives?
Yes, it is an active field of study among some scientists. The kind of the pioneer in that sort of work was Dr. Ian Stevenson, who was a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. And he and his colleagues that he trained investigated past lives reported by young children. Like an older person could go on the web and go do other kinds of research and perhaps come up with a convincing past life story. But children, 3, 4 years old, they don't go out and do research like that. So what he was able to do, he studied thousands of cases from all different parts of the world, from the United States and Europe, but also from other countries in Asia and Africa. And what they would find is that these children would maybe say to their mother or father, I have another father and mother, so, and they would give stories of what the family they previously lived among were like, what the village or town was like where they grew up, what happened to them. And Stevenson and his team would go out and carefully interview these children, get every possible detail that they could. Generally, when the children grow older, they kind of lose these memories of past lives. But they would carefully record them, and then they would try to see if they could identify the person the child claimed to have been. And they weren't claiming to be, like Cleopatra or Napoleon. They were claiming to be ordinary people, practically speaking, in most cases, who happened to have died shortly before the times that these children were born. So, like in a particular case, the child said she had been born in a village in India, not the one that she was born in this life, but in some other life, and was a member of a certain family. So the researchers would take the child to the village, and the child would lead them through the streets to the house where they once lived. And she said, I lived in this house. And then they would go and meet the people who lived in the house. And the child would say, this was my husband, this was my uncle, this one was my some other relative. And then the child would even say things like, I was a woman living in this house and these relatives. And if you go upstairs, you'll find a chest, and in it, there'll be a sari. A sari is kind of like the standard garment for a woman in India. You go up there, you'll find a sari with red and blue patterns on it, and they go up and they find it. It's like, so there is research like that going on past life histories.
Sometimes that type of thing leaves me speechless because I just think it's so amazing. It really takes my breath away to think about that. And I know there's many cases, but it also seems to be the same thing when it comes to the near-death experience as well. I mean, of course, you probably know about Danny and Brinkley, but there's many reports of it. Reinterpret or rethink about what it means to die, or even in terms of spirit. What I really wanted, for me, it opened my mind because once I was able to kind of break free of that whole Darwin evolution theory that they press on, once I was able to break free of that and open my mind, I've always felt that, but once I was able to really get my mind wrapped around the possibility that it could be other alternatives, it makes you think about the deeper things, like you were talking about consciousness and spirit, because you really have to rethink everything. And I think you have to rethink everything in every discipline as well, because like you said, the knowledge filtration is going on in every discipline. So who knows, and everything really, how many billions of years old, maybe in 50, 100 years to have another billion, all evolving. But also found your work really corroborates with other people's work. Like for instance, with Dr. Robert Schoch, he talked about how the Sphinx at the Great Pyramid site in Giza is way older than the Egyptologists say it is. Have you kind of looked into that or had any research or knowledge of Egyptology?
So I know Robert Schoch. Sometimes we speak at the same conferences and we catch up with each other. I know he and his wife spend a lot of time on Easter Island and places like that. But he's a geologist. Yeah, he's a trained geologist. I think he's at Boston University.
Yeah.
And he went to Egypt. And the Sphinx is in an enclosure. It's like it's like some area was excavated and the Sphinx was built on it. So around that enclosure, it's like walls of earth and stone, 10 or 12 feet high.
Mm-hmm.
There are channels etched into the sediments that show vast amounts of water had been flowing. Now that area of Egypt is now pretty dry, doesn't get much rain. You have to go back at least 11,000 years to the time when you would have enough rain in that area that would cut those channels into those enclosure walls around the Sphinx. And then there were people like Robert Maval and Grant Hancock who studied the alignment of these different structures like the pyramids, Giza pyramids. They're aligned to where the star positions would have been over 13,000 years ago. So, of course, that's on, I kind of mostly deal with deeper time than that.
Right.
Hundreds of millions of years. But the research that's being done on, say, the past 50,000 years is also very important because current dominant consensus is that before about 10,000 years ago, people were just hunter-gatherers, all of them. There were no permanent settlements like villages. There was no agriculture, cultivation of crops. There was no animal husbandry, no domesticated animals, so that settled village life is something they say started about 10,000 years ago. And then they say a few thousand years after that, you get towns and cities and developed architecture like pyramids and things like that, around 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. So what they've been able to show, these researchers who are looking into that end of the spectrum, is that there was civilization, there was monumental architecture, there were urban areas, maybe going back as far as 12 or 13,000 years ago. I mean, one case that's attracted a lot of attention is the monumental stone slabs that were discovered at a place called Göbekli Tepe in what's now Turkey. So there they had stones like about the size of the ones you see in the pyramid, not the pyramids, Stonehenge.
Right, Stonehenge.
In England. But they're far older than the Stonehenge ones. They've got these massive carved stone columns with images of animals and geometrical patterns on them that had originally been set up for obviously some kind of ritual purpose involving the activities of many people in a very coordinated way. So the researchers who are dealing with that end of the time spectrum, they're also developing evidence that requires some revision of the current ideas about the origins of monumental architecture, civilization, in other words.
Right. I mean, I've always thought that. And it's when you bring it up in, after college, they kind of just dismiss it. But, it doesn't make sense that only 10,000 years, the whole timeline kind of from then up until now, to especially when you consider, modern times where if you consider, the rate of technology, it doesn't add up. So, kind of it's good to have alternative theories. And I think when it comes down to what is cool is like all those Graham Hancock and Robert Schoch, they have their research, but what you're digging into kind of shows even farther, millions of years. So last couple of things, but I wanted to ask, so is there evidence for people kind of out there that have any, doubt or there's myths about it, but in your opinion, or with all the work you've done with Forbidden Archaeology, is there any good evidence that there was a human being's presence, modern human being presence at the same time of the planet when there was dinosaurs? Is there any evidence of that?
There's some evidence that I consider consistent with that idea. You have cases like one of the ones I mentioned in my book, Extreme Human Antiquity,
Right.
Which is about evidence that came to my attention after Forbidden Archaeology was published. There's an interesting case there of dinosaur bone that was found in England, and it was a seagoing dinosaur, like a big. I forget the exact name of the species, Ichthyosaurus.
Okay.
Something like that. But it's a dinosaur bone, but it's got cut marks on it, like we were talking earlier about the cut marks on the mammoth bone. So it's a bona fide type of archaeological evidence, cut marks indicating butchering of this animal by someone that was using very sharp flint tools to cut off the flesh. It's something that is normally attributed only to human beings. And the scientist who discovered this said, well, that he didn't believe that human beings were present, but he said in his report that if this had been found along with other objects in an archaeological site that was more recent. This was from the Jurassic period, I believe.
Okay.
Age of the dinosaurs. If this had been found in a more recent formation, there'd be no doubt about those cut marks being attributed to human beings because they look exactly like bones and that have cut marks on them that are from these more recent periods. Definitely from, but the reason these can't be accepted as being made by humans is that everyone knows humans didn't exist during the Jurassic. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird way where like sometimes, and I was talking earlier, but like, and someone mentioned it, but it's very true where you talk about, true science. True science doesn't, ignore or ridicule or kind of just end at some point. You have to investigate it, like no matter what it is, wherever it takes you, which is why I find, and it's true, a lot of science is closed-minded and dogmatic, and even with topics like yours, unable to even accept it or debate it or talk about it. Like the last guest I had on a few months ago, he was a former professor. He's an archaeologist himself in Mesoamerica, made a lot of discoveries, but he's total academic and would not accept any, because I mentioned your book towards the end, and he basically just said, none of it's true, there's no evidence. And I said, really? He's like, yeah, any evidence is fake, not true. I was like, but he had never heard of you, that's the funny part. And they don't read your book, they just kind of assume through all their academic teachings that they've been trained in that it can't be possible, and that's their whole paradigm. Just kind of in closing, I really want to talk to how, and what I respected about your work is that it led to consciousness and kind of spirituality, and which to me is positive because of the curiosity aspect, but you never really got into any of the negative. But I wanted you to end on kind of like what it means, like, okay, like how you were saying earlier, if human beings are around, we have to rethink everything in terms of our existence, what it means to be human, and really what it means for humans now, like ethically, spiritually, if we can, like, everybody can get on the same level, we realize what you're talking about, consciousness. Maybe we can maybe if people were on that level globally, it would be a different place, and it wasn't so much about individual selfishness and ego and stuff like that. So that's kind of, I think, where you're leading with it eventually, which is cool, right? It's a positive, it's a try to like make it positive and make a difference.
Yes, because if we're told, as we are being told now, that we are machines made of molecules in competition with each other for survival, individually and collectively, you get a certain type of culture, a certain type of values and goals and objectives in life that grow out of such a conception of our identity. And I mean, this is the real ultimate issue, I believe, is that our goals and values and the way we live our lives are determined pretty much by our sense of identity. And the sense of identity that is being dictated to us now by the scientific world, which is extremely physicalist and materialist at this point, if we allow them through their monopoly and the education systems in most places in the world, that if we take that sense of identity, then our goals and values and objectives become very materialistic, which means that we think to produce and consume more and more material things, whether it's by AI or whatever. If that becomes our main purpose in life, well, that process generates wealth, and the wealth flows into the pockets of certain people. And yeah, in other words, the acquisition of that wealth that's generated by all this material activity goes into certain pockets, and there's competition for it. And you wind up with a world like the one we have now, where there's competition and violence on every level of human society. We see it all around us, see it everywhere. And we also wind up with destroying the environment that we exist in. And we see that going on all over the world. So if we had a different sense of identity, like I'm not a machine made of molecules in competition with each other for survival, and dividing ourselves up into so many competing groups on the basis of race, nationality, gender, religion, even. If we had the idea that we're all beings of pure consciousness and we can satisfy our material needs in the most simple, natural, fair, and efficient way possible, and put most of our human energy into developing the resource of consciousness, raising consciousness to the level where we're no longer subjected to engagement and temporary material bodily vehicles that are so limiting in so many ways, that if we could do that, we would have an entirely different set of political, social, cultural, financial institutions and practices. It would be quite different. But I think that all depends upon our sense of identity. So the two basic choices are, we can have a consciousness-based picture of who we are and where we are and what the ultimate reality is, or we can have a matter-based picture of reality with all the competition, violence, exploitation that involves. So that's what I believe the essential choices that we all face. Are we going to go towards a more consciousness-based picture of who we are, where we are, and where we should be heading? Or are we going to remain stuck in the matter-based picture of reality that's being dictated to us through our current scientific and educational institutions?
Yeah, that's so deep. It hits so deep and powerful, especially for people.
Coming up, there is a pretty exciting event that I'm going to be participating in next year in June around the solstice time.
Okay.
June 14th to the 21st in Bosnia.
Oh, is that the pyramids event?
Pyramid, there's going to be a conference and festival organized by Sam Osmanagic, who was the discoverer and has promoted this. He's holding a conference there. I'll be speaking on my Facebook page, Michael Cremo, It's Really Me. There's information about that. And it's also on my website, mcremo.com. Cool. So that I'm kind of really looking forward to that. There's going to be a lot of other researchers there. I think Graham Hancock is one of them. Other luminaries, you could say, in this field.
Yeah, the Bosnian period, that's always been a fascinating topic too. You know, not many people know about it, but you know, it brings up really the whole topic of pyramids outside of Egypt around the whole world. You know, and they've claims, you know, older pyramids in China, different parts of East Europe, and even Africa that are older. So it definitely, you know, raises a new topic that I think should be explored. So that's definitely awesome. Really, really appreciate your time. I really respect your work. And like I said, it's a mind opener for anyone who kind of is stuck in that just that closed-minded path. Coming to a you know, someone who's worked like yours, coming to a topic like that and really reading about it, researching and like understanding it really opens your mind up to like way other. It brings you to another mindset where you can really accept other possibilities. It's really cool
Well,
to
I think
experience.
I feel I'm part of a community. I'm not in this all by myself. I mean, there are people who are doing research and writing. I enjoy all aspects of my work, whether it's the research and the writing and getting something published and out there in different forms. And I think persons like yourselves who are creating channels of communication and community are doing a fantastic job. And also those who are listening, taking the time to listen and perhaps influence others who they know. That's also a part of it. Everybody has their part to play. And I kind of see the whole world as in a renegotiating our whole fundamental picture of reality and moving more in the direction of this consciousness-based picture of everything rather than a strictly matter-based picture.
And it's great talking to you. It's an honor.
Thank you. It's great
Awesome.
talking.